meeting of the Work and Pensions Select Committee, and a warm welcome and thanks to our witnesses who've joined us for both the panels that we're looking forward to taking evidence from this morning. Can I ask, first of all, the members of the first panel just very briefly to introduce yourself to us, starting with Rob Geaney.
Hi, good morning. My name is Rob Geaney. I'm Head of Campaigns and Public Affairs at the Royal National Institute for Deaf People, the RNID.
Thank you very much indeed. Martin Sigsworth.
Hi there, yes, I'm Martin Sigsworth. I'm the Senior Employment Manager at Thomas Pocklington Trust, and we work with blind and partially sighted people.
Thank you. And Daniel Jennings.
Good morning, Daniel Jennings. I'm the Senior Policy and Campaigns Officer at Epilepsy Action.
Thank you all for being with us. And can I put to each of you two questions? I'll give you both of them and ask you both to comment on both of them in answering. First of all, do you think the disability employment gap is a useful measure, or do you think there's something more useful that we should be looking at? And secondly, do you think employers should be required to report how many disabled people they employ and how much they're paid? Would you like to see that being an obligation on employers? Can I ask you each to comment on both of those points, starting with Rob Geaney?
Yeah, so we definitely see value in the overall disability employment target, and we welcome the fact that it's been committed to by the government. I certainly think reducing the disability employment gap has the potential to really benefit the individuals' lives, but also change society's attitudes towards disability and making sure that disability is visible and accepted in the workplace. I think it's a necessary target, but I agree that it's potentially not sufficient. We know that from our sort of survey work, around half of the people with hearing loss feel that their careers have been limited because of their hearing loss. And so I think, as well as this sort of binary focus on in and out of work, there possibly is value in more subtle and complex data around career progression, pay gaps and other issues. On mandatory reporting, we are sympathetic and we see why it would be a useful tool to have. The only thing that makes us slightly nervous is that because hearing loss is a hidden disability, we know that lots of people don't disclose their hearing loss to their employer. We think that roughly half of people with hearing loss don't provide that information at the recruitment stage, and then a similar proportion again won't tell their employer about their hearing loss, often because they think they will be judged as unable to perform their job, or because they just don't think any reasonable adjustments will be made, and therefore they don't see the purpose and the value in going through that process. And so I think before we get to the point where mandatory reporting has real value, we need to identify some of the ways we can increase the reporting and the disclosure of disability and hearing loss to make sure that mandatory reporting has value and it doesn't actually create false information.
Thank you very much. Mr. Sigsworth.
Yes, absolutely. So at Thomas Pocklington Trust, we completely support the target of reducing the disability employment gap. We believe it's too high, but what we particularly like to see is a kind of further breakdown into the representation of different disabilities. So, for example, research within the sight loss sector suggests that 75% of blind and partially sighted people are currently out of work, which is quite a lot higher than that of the general disability kind of public, if that makes sense. So, you know, government and people and employers being aware that there is an existing disability employment gap, but that gap is actually a lot wider for blind and partially sighted people, we feel is really important and should be noted. So yes, as I say, we do support it, but some further breakdown of different disability types, I think, would be really beneficial as well for us to be able to see themes and identify groups which are maybe even more underrepresented within the workplace. In terms of mandatory reporting, similar to what Rob just said, we do kind of have some reporting, particularly from partially sighted people who are able to kind of get by without telling their employer that they have a disability. There is certainly a reluctance with people to tell their employer that, and they'll try and get by. So, you know, again, the data might not be as accurate. However, saying that, one of the anecdotally, what we hear from a lot of blind and partially sighted people is that they'd like to know which employers do employ disabled people and they're kind of walking the walk, so to speak. So in that regard, as an organisation that's working with people to find them employment, that would be handy if we knew, if we had reporting which told us these employers do employ disabled people and have got a good record, and this is how many they employ, and it gives us that evidence to, you know, to kind of say confidently to direct people to those kind of employers. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Jennings.
Yeah, I would echo a lot of what Rob and Martin have just said. And from the ONS figures, we know that only 34% of people with epilepsy are in employment. And again, that's a lot lower than other disability groups as well. And on top of that, research by the TUC has pointed out that on average, people with epilepsy are paid 11.8% less than non-disabled workers. So people with epilepsy, they find it more difficult to get into work, and when they are in work, they're paid less than other workers are. So we would definitely support both targets to reduce the disability employment gap, but also mandatory reporting, both on the disability employment gap and the disability pay gap. I think that would help. And again, I would echo what the previous witnesses have said as well about reporting further on specific impairment groups as well, so we can identify themes and particular problem areas and provide targeted support to those groups that we can see are then having more problem getting into the employment market.
Thank you all very much. Nigel Mills.
Thank you. Can I just ask the panel if they could outline what they think the main barriers to employment are that the people they are supporting facing in trying to get into work or sustain that work?
Who wants to?
So happy to go first if that's okay.
Yeah.
I think all of our survey research on this has shown that the biggest barriers faced by people who are deaf or have hearing loss tends to be employer attitudes. I think it's not that employers don't want to do the right thing, but I think often they struggle to find the information and the resources. People think that hearing loss isn't well understood in the workplace or wider across society. And as I think I outlined in our written evidence, we've done some research on this, which showed that 35% of business leaders wouldn't know how to communicate with somebody with a hearing loss. Around a quarter thought that deaf people were a health and safety risk, which obviously is a complete myth. And we also know that the majority of employers don't know where to go to get help and information and advice. And I think that all builds up to a point where employers, often who want to do the right thing and want to support disabled members of staff, don't know how to, and that creates barriers in the workplace. I also think it's really important to think not just about barriers in getting into work, but we know that people with hearing loss and lots of other disabled people are far more likely to leave the labour market, particularly for people with hearing loss take early retirement. So as well as thinking about barriers to the employment market, it's also important to think about barriers within them so that people don't drop out prematurely.
Okay, thank you. Martin, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So again, you know, following on from what Rob just said, employer attitudes is a big barrier which a lot of blind and partially sighted people report to us and report to our employment advisors, and they feel that, you know, they've gone for roles and not got them on the grounds of being blind and partially sighted, and the employer not being confident about being able to support them within that role, which is quite hard to, you know, it is quite hard for them then to bring any action against that, even when it's quite clear. Another major barrier is inaccessible recruitment processes for blind and partially sighted people, particularly as more application forms move online. We're noticing that there's a lot of inaccessible application forms online, which blind and partially sighted people struggle to access because it doesn't work very well with their assistive technology. So, you know, when it comes to filling out the form to even be considered for the job, they're struggling at that stage, which makes it impossible for them to then get an interview. And finally, kind of confidence and competence using the assistive technology which they need for the workplace. Currently, there's no clear provision of support to train blind and partially sighted people to use the assistive technology that they need to be able to access the labour market. So, for example, if somebody with a degenerative eye condition loses their sight in their 40s, there's no support if they're out of work to show them how to use the assistive technology that they'll need to be able to re-enter the labour market. And this is a big problem which is faced by blind and partially sighted people, because, you know, it's a big piece of technology which people need to be able to use and need to be able to use competently to be able to succeed in the workplace. And if they're not getting the training to use it, it can be, you know, and then they enter work, an employer isn't able to support them with it, and an employer also can't wait for them to get the training to become competent at it, to be able to do that job. So it's a bit of a vicious circle.
Thank you. And Daniel, any comments?
Yeah, I mean, similarly, it is one of the main barriers is a lack of understanding from employers. I mean, we understand that as a fluctuating and invisible condition, epilepsy can be quite difficult to understand. But actually, just by undertaking some quite simple training, as the sort that Epilepsy Action provides, employers can and their co-workers can understand how to help and support people with epilepsy more in the workplace. And we know from our experiences that can make a huge difference. But at the moment, there is just a lack of understanding, and there's still quite a lot of discrimination and stigma against people with epilepsy. We know that from our research, over a quarter of UK employees would be wary of working with someone with epilepsy, and a majority of UK employers wouldn't know how to help someone when they were having a seizure. But again, undertaking some quite simple training can help dispel these discrimination and lack of understanding, and just make the workplace a more confident and comfortable place for people with epilepsy.
Okay, thank you. I think you said previously people with epilepsy have one of the lowest employment rates amongst disabled people, down as low as around a third. Do you have any feeling as to why this is, when you might assume that a fluctuating condition perhaps will be in a better position than one that doesn't fluctuate?
Well, again, it is mainly a lack of understanding, and as I think Rob and Martin have both previously mentioned, a lot of people with epilepsy, because partly of past experiences, are unwilling to disclose their epilepsy at application stage. And once they do disclose their epilepsy, a lot of people have had past experiences where they are sidelined in the workplace because of this lack of understanding. So past experiences can go a long way to affecting people with epilepsy's mental health, and then that has a knock-on effect on their confidence and willingness to apply for jobs going forward. And I think what we have seen is a focus on what people with epilepsy can't do in the workplace, as opposed to what they can do in the workplace. And I think just kind of challenging and improving some of those employer attitudes would go a long way to making people with epilepsy more confident in applying for higher jobs as well. And I think another issue is kind of job retention. Some employers, when a worker is diagnosed with epilepsy, are great, and they can put support in place quite quickly. But others, once a diagnosis is revealed, are quite quick to sideline people with epilepsy. So I think more needs to be done looking at job retention as well, and keeping people in the job market once they've got in.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Debbie Abrahams.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. I just want to follow up on Nigel's questions. We're going to have various specific questions on different policy measures over the next half an hour or so. I just wondered if you were starting from scratch, if you had a blank sheet of paper, what would you want to see in terms of the policy measures that would address the barriers that you've identified? Shall we start in reverse order? Start with Daniel.
Yeah, happy to go first. I think, again, looking at job retention, there aren't enough schemes at the moment to keep people in work. Access to work is great when it works, but it's one of the only schemes out there looking at job retention. So I think more schemes keeping people in the job market once they're in would be invaluable. But I think one of the main things we'd want to see as well is more disabled people involved in these reforms. All too often we don't see that kind of engagement with disabled people in designing systems that work for them. So as far as possible, involving disabled people in reforms and decision making would go a long way to better understanding how we can help them. And another issue is that a lot of the support out there is far too generic. I think that there are a lot of programs out there, but there's not enough focused support. And again, going back to mandatory reporting, if we could understand the different impairment groups and where that support's needed, and then focus that support on those groups, that would go a long way as well.
You're on mute, Debbie.
Sorry, I tried to unmute myself and it wouldn't allow me. So on to Martin, if that's all right. Thanks so much, Dan.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, similar to what Dan's just said, I think a more tailored approach for support for different types of disabilities is going to be really important. One thing that we've noticed through delivering the support that we do to blind and partially sighted people is that not everybody needs the same level of support. So, you know, somebody might just need somebody to check the formatting of an application form before they submit it, whereas somebody might need the help to understand how to complete an application form, and those are two very different cases. We'd also like to see much more support put in place for blind and partially sighted people to understand the assistive technology which is available to them in the workplace, and training to be provided on how they can use that, so when they do get roles, they can hit the ground running and they're not relying on access to work to provide that training to them in the first maybe 3 to 6 months of their role, where an employer is waiting for them to be able to use their assistive technology effectively, and you know that again is going to improve job retention. And I'd say those are the two main kind of areas really. More training around assistive technology and greater bespoke support for blind and partially sighted people.
Fantastic, thank you, Martin. And finally, Rob.
Again, I think I'm going to largely agree with my sort of fellow witnesses, particularly Martin's point about user involvement in the design of policies. I think we see the DWP are very good sometimes at engaging with DPOs, disabled charities and disabled peoples around relatively small-scale issues, so sort of reasonable adjustments, but not necessarily the design of the big issue policies. I think it's really hard to say what the sort of the one silver bullet in all of this is. I think one of the frustrations we have is that some of the simple, easy bits of low-hanging fruit out there, the government just haven't taken them on. And I think we've all talked so far about employer attitudes being the big problem. That doesn't stem from employers not sort of wanting to do the right thing and not having the good intentions, but there just isn't the advice, the support and the guidance out there for them to do so. So we've been arguing now for a couple of years that the government should create an online employer information hub which is well advertised, contains lots of information around employment, disability law, guides on individual conditions, signposting to other organisations, and just those simple steps to help make reasonable adjustments. And I know a website's not that easy, but it doesn't seem like an incredibly difficult thing to do, and therefore we're not quite sure why the government haven't taken that small step, which just addresses one of the big barriers that all of us have identified. So if I had to pick one thing, it would be that creation of an employers' information hub, where employers can get the knowledge and the reassurance they need to be able to do the right thing as they want to do.
Fantastic, some very tangible examples. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. Sir Desmond Swain.
In January, the Journal of Public Health noted that working age adults with a disability had been disproportionately financially affected by the pandemic. Intuitively, I would have thought that home working and reliance on technology would have favoured adults with disabilities, but clearly the reports are that actually they've worked fewer hours on the job retention scheme furlough. What do you anticipate will happen at the end of furlough in respect of their employment, and why do you think they have been disproportionately affected?
I'm happy to start on that one again if it helps. I think one of the key things that's often overlooked with this is the digital skills and the digital access that disabled people have. I think Ofcom have research which shows that 95% of households have internet access. That drops to something like 67% for deaf people, and I think it's 65% for disabled people overall. And therefore, those extra costs of the pandemic and those extra barriers to work for some disabled and deaf people have existed because of that online access. I think it is really difficult to say what will happen to disability employment after the pandemic. We as a charity are certainly concerned that the pandemic has thrown up new barriers in the way of disabled people and their employment chances. For deaf people, the use of face coverings in the workplace, partitions and rearranging office spaces so that people are encouraged to sit back to back all makes life harder for deaf people who rely on lip reading or other forms of communication support. And I don't think there's been enough for employers. Employers have been given enough information to understand and respond to those barriers. And I think if some of those things are with us in the long term, unless they're addressed and unless employers are given guidance on how to make new reasonable adjustments because of COVID's measures, we may well see more deaf people sort of discriminated against and finding life in the workplace harder.
I'm happy to go next, if that's okay. One of the things which has been reported by people accessing TPT's, Thomas Pocklington Trust's employment services, when it comes to home working, has been the platforms which employers are using to facilitate that home working. Now, these aren't always compatible with the screen reader and magnification software that people are using. Now, on paper, for a blind or partially sighted person, more home working generally is favourable because it cuts out the need for travel, which can, obviously be a cause of anxiety for people and a cause of difficulty. But if the platforms that employers are using to facilitate home working aren't accessible with the assistive technology that individual's using, then that means that they're unable to unable to work as efficiently as maybe if they'd been in the office. Another kind of issue which we had particularly in the early days was access to support workers due to people not being able to have their support worker come to the home due to the regulations which were in place around social distancing and people visiting your home. If the support worker wasn't a part of their family, particularly at the start, it was difficult for them to be able to do some of the tasks which they would have relied on a support worker to do while they've been in the office. I think looking at longer term, it'll be. I think one of the great things has been how access to work has brought in a blended approach, and we'd like to see that continue. So support for blind and partially sighted individuals when they're having to go into the office and also when they're having to work from home has been really positive, and we'd like to see that continue. And yeah, that's probably the main thing really for us.
From our point of view, kind of the pandemic has very much been a mixed bag for people with epilepsy. Where people can work from home, it has been massively beneficial. Again, with people not having to travel to work, that takes out a big stress of the possibility of experiencing a seizure in public. But generally speaking, we know that disabled people are more likely to be working in kind of frontline services. So their experiences have been kind of worsened during the pandemic. The added stress of the possibility of having a seizure and ending up in hospital during COVID is massive for people with epilepsy, and we know that stress is one of the main triggers for seizures. So kind of going forward, we're concerned that, again, looking at kind of employer attitudes, people with disabilities are likely to be the ones let go first, really. And again, furloughs added kind of a massive financial stress to people with epilepsy, which again leads to them having more seizures. So it is very much a mixed bag, and where people can work from home, I think hopefully that will continue going forward. But again, when they can't, it creates more stress. So it's very much a mixed bag.
Thank you. Celine Saxby.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Do you think that the employment support programmes that the DWP has introduced during the pandemic, such as Kickstart and Restart, will provide the support that disabled people need to move into work? Who would like to go first?
I'm happy to go first on this one. I think the short answer is no. I don't think, again, both programmes are quite generic. They're not targeted enough at disabled people. And one of the main issues that have been raised with Epilepsy Action about both schemes is that you need to be on universal credit to access them. But we're aware of many people still on employment support allowance who can't access these schemes. So it's not helping them to start moving into work.
Thank you. Rob, did you have anything you'd like to add?
I mean, I think I'll mainly echo what Daniel says about the generic nature of many of these provisions. We know from the services we provide that specialist support with an understanding of deafness, and particularly for first language BSL users, is instrumental in the success of those employment schemes. And these schemes the governments have created in response to the pandemic have been very generic.
And Martin, do you have anything you'd like to add?
I've got nothing to add that the guys haven't already said. I think well, there's one thing to add. The blind and partially sighted people that we've been working with when we've suggested these schemes, there's certainly been a lot of anxiety from our clients about applying for them because they've been let down by these sort of schemes before, and they don't feel that they support the unique kind of support which a blind and partially sighted person will need within that work placement, and even through the recruitment stage as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Steve McCabe.
Sorry about that, Chair. I was just trying to unmute myself. Good morning. I want to ask about your experience of the work and health programme in particular. We've heard evidence from a number of sources that it's not that effective when it comes to disabled people. I think it's the Spinal Muscular Atrophy UK group say that 8 in 10 disabled people didn't achieve the defined job outcome under the programme. And the Centre for Social Justice Disability Commission said that only 14% of disabled people who took part moved into employment as a result. What's your own experience of the work and health programme, and indeed some of the other programmes, but that in particular?
Happy to kick off again if that helps.
Yeah, please.
I think from our perspective, we've delivered employment services through a range of different funding schemes, and we've found that some of the other schemes potentially allow us to do more for those that are slightly further away from the labour market. I think for some deaf people, again, particularly BSL users, it's a long time before they can sort of get to even employment-related activities. Before you get to that stage, there may be a housing issue, a social care issue, a benefits issue, and it may be a couple of months of working with the individual before we can even get to the point where we're talking about the activities they need to move into work. And I think the Work and Health programme, because of some of the limits on how long individuals can be on that scheme, and because of the fact that essentially the payment by results mechanism is so blunt around finding work, that it's difficult to providers to invest in those furthest from the labour market, whereas more flexible schemes that allow us to work with individuals for longer and recognise that taking steps to get closer to the labour market without moving into the labour market are incredibly important, have just allowed us to provide better support in different types of schemes.
Thank you. And Daniel or Martin, do you have anything?
Yeah, I can come in there. So with the Thomas Pocklington Trust employment support, it's all completely we're self-funded, so we're not reliant on any government contracts or any funding. But what we have noticed is that when we have engaged with people that have been delivering the work and health programme, is as soon as they get a blind or partially sighted person, they're quite keen to pass them over to us rather than work with them themselves. They, because of the specialist support that we can offer, which is all well and good, but equally it does mean that if we don't operate in an area where somebody is accessing that work and health programme, I'm not sure what support they are getting. We also haven't had much, if any, examples come through where a blind and partially sighted person has gone through the work and health programme and succeeded and ended up working. So, I'm not sure it is working for blind and partially sighted people from what I can tell.
I'd echo both what Rob and Martin have said. We haven't had many examples, if any at all, of people who've been successful through the work and health programme. But I think, generally speaking, the most damning indictment of all the programmes available is that the disability employment gap has remained stable for a long time now. So it's clear that while there are a lot of programmes out there, they're not having the impact that's needed to close the disability employment gap.
Yeah, thank you. And Daniel, Rob, I wondered if I could ask you in particular about Job Centre Plus staff. I read quite a damning account from RNID about Job Centre Plus staff insisting that someone must use the phone in order to raise their issue. What is your experience of trying to deal with Job Centre Plus staff?
I think it is incredibly mixed, if we're being honest. I think there is some brilliant practice out there. I've been to myself to some job centres and they've shown us the measures they put in, but it does appear to be a bit of sort of luck for the individual and whether their job centre has done the things they need to do. One of the things that I think has seen a slight improvement, but we're not there yet, is the way that an individual's communication preferences are recorded within their Universal Credit Journal is a step forward. But we would like to see much further the job centre think systematically about how they capture and implement a user's communication preferences. And I think we've suggested that the NHS actually has a model called the Accessible Information Standard, where, let's say, the communication preference is held on a patient record, and then the support and the adjustments they need should, in theory, follow them around the NHS. And we would like to see a model very close to that potentially brought into the job centre. So it's an automated process. The communication support needs are captured and then automatically provided as that person moves around the system.
Right, so that would be one very practical measure that could be implemented. Thank you. And Martin, I noticed that Thomas Pocklington have called for better training for Job Centre Plus staff. What do you have in mind? What training in particular?
We have it's more training around understanding sight loss in particular. So the support that somebody might need. A lot of people that access our service describe having problems kind of getting to Job Centre Plus, getting around Job Centre Plus. People not really kind of knowing how to guide them properly or the support that they might need. So you might arrive at the job centre and you're going to need support to get to where you need to go, but they might be left standing outside or might be left standing inside. Similar to what Rob said, partners of TPT, particularly in London and previously in Birmingham, we have done work with Job Centre Plus and they are open to this training. But it's very reliant on organisations going to them directly to offer it. rather than it being anything that staff members get in as mandatory training when they're working in the job centre plus environment. So kind of general visual awareness training for any blind or partially sighted person that's arriving at that centre would be really, really beneficial, and I think would alleviate a lot of the anxieties that blind and partially sighted people have when they attend the Job Centre Plus.
Okay, thank you. And Daniel, I noticed that that Epilepsy Action has called for more disability employment advisors. Well, the department says they're going to employ another 315. Does that mean you're satisfied? Do you think that's a job done?
No, I don't think so. No, we want to see more than the stated number so far, and I think we'd need to see how that worked in practice. And ideally, we want to see job coaches with specific understanding of specific conditions, again, to target that support. So someone with epilepsy should be seeing a job coach who has an understanding of the condition and the barriers to employment, so they can work on a more individual basis to help the individual and address the specific problems that they have.
Okay. How many more than 315 would you say are needed?
I mean, it's difficult to know, to put a number on it, but again, I think we need to see how it worked in practice, and ideally, we want specific training for people, for the job coaches to understand epilepsy, and then, so, I mean, in a perfect world, we'd want to see every job centre have a specific epilepsy job coach who understood epilepsy, and ideally that replicated across all the disabilities. Now, that might be a bit of a pipe dream, but in an ideal world, that is something that we would want to see. Okay,
but you couldn't put a figure on that at the moment. Can I just ask finally, I'm conscious of time, but in April 2019, the department ended the Community Partners scheme. And when I asked the department about this, they said, well, you know, it wasn't that great a loss because it's been subsumed within other activities. How significant was that scheme, and do you think it has been a loss, or have you noticed it? I think that's for everyone, but quickly.
Happy to start again. I think we're aware that some areas community partners did have an impact, but again, it seems to be a role that wasn't particularly well defined. It was very much on individual job centres or regions of job centres to almost define the purpose of that role. And I think it comes back to the points that sort of Martin and Daniel have already made, where whether or not community partners stay, I think it's actually part of a bigger question about the training that's provided to work coaches, the specialist support they have to access. And so I wouldn't necessarily fixate on community partners individually, but the whole package of support and training as a whole, which at the moment just collectively isn't meeting the needs of deaf people in the job centre.
Okay, thanks. And Martin?
I'd second that. The community partnerships was very, very hit and miss. I know that I think from reporting from sector partners, I believe it worked fairly well in the North East. Again, that was because organisations had been quite active in building those relationships up, and that had worked. However, in other areas, it had been kind of, it had minimal effect. So I think generally, an overhaul of the support which is provided to disabled people within job centre settings is kind of more important than the reinstating community partners, and also a greater understanding of different disabilities and the support needs that those individuals have. The support is quite generic, particularly the blind and partially sighted people receive at the moment. So, I think a greater focus on providing tailored support for somebody's disability, and these coaches have an expertise. It doesn't need to be just, a job coach that can specialise for a blind and partially sighted person, but rather than them being expected to be able to support every single type of disability that walks through the door, they maybe have 2 or 3 specialisms that they can work on.
Okay, thanks. So, not a great loss then. Is that your view as well, Daniel?
Yeah, I'd echo both what Rob and Martin have said. It was very much a postcode lottery, and from our experience, we didn't see that it had much of an impact on our cohort of people.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Can I put a question to you now? One argument that's been put to us is that local commissioning for employment support for disabled people would work better than the national commissioning. Can I ask each of you what you think about that argument? Shall I start with Martin this time? Do you think local commissioning would work better?
It obviously would depend on how you're defining local and what the remit of that would be, because for blind and partially sighted people, it would very much depend on where they're having to attend and things like that. So, local can mean the northeast of England. So would somebody in Middlesbrough be able to get to somewhere in Newcastle? That's going to be extremely difficult. So it would depend on it would depend on where where the support was being delivered from and what was defined as local, because mobility and transport is an issue for blind and partially sighted people. I think in terms of understanding the labour market in those regions, though, that would definitely be a positive. I think there's what we've noticed with the delivery that we do, that working with blind and partially sighted people in London compared to somebody that's in Liverpool or Manchester, the landscape is very different and the challenges are very different, particularly around public transport and being able to access public transport, and also the job opportunities which are there. So yeah, I'd say that there is some benefits, but also we really need to take, again, it'd be how tailored that's going to be towards different types of disability, and making sure that the support which those individuals are getting is going to work for them. It doesn't matter whether it's local or national. If it isn't tailored to the needs of a blind and partially sighted person, or it's inaccessible to them, it doesn't matter where you deliver it. It needs to be right for the individual. So.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Daniel.
I would echo a lot of what Martin said. There are positives and negatives to providing support locally. Local kind of support would be better able to identify employers in the local area that have a good track record, but you do risk a postcode lottery of some support in some areas being better than in others. So I think it would need a strong national framework of how that support would work, for it to work properly locally and make sure provision is fair across the board, and some areas are not kind of benefiting more than others. Ideally, yes, local support would be fantastic, and you could build up support with local employers. But again, we don't want to run the risk of a postcode lottery and some people being disadvantaged in that system.
Thank you. And Rob?
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what's already been said. I think there are benefits to local, but I think the key concern for us has always been specialist compared to generic rather than local versus national. And I think it's the ability to deliver specialist services that understand specific conditions. And I say RNID is a supplier of employment support, where we've been able to deliver projects over quite large regions. They've been sustainable and they've been deliverable. In the past, because we deliver specialist services, we've been asked to register with individual job centres, sort of almost on the basis of if we have somebody who can come to you. And we're now being unable to do that purely because of the time and the effort, and because it's not sustainable for us to deliver a service for a small number of people in an area. It is sustainable for us to deliver a service for a relatively small group of people over a slightly larger group of people over a larger area. And so whilst I see the benefits of local over national, I think we at RNID are far more interested in specialist over generic. It's the big factor in what makes a difference.
Okay, thank you very much. Chris Stevens.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I think Rob had answered some of the questions I'm going to ask when he answered Debbie Abraham's question. So I'm going to ask Martin and Daniel first. I'll maybe ask Rob to emphasise these points, but Martin and Daniel, thinking back to my time as a trade union rep, which wasn't that long ago, and having heard the evidence we've heard so far in this inquiry, we're getting the evidence that some employers and some managers just have a basic lack of understanding of reasonable adjustments and how to implement them. Is that a view that you both share, and do you have a specific example or a striking example that you would want to give to the committee? So, Martin, you first.
Yeah, there's definitely a lack of knowledge around reasonable adjustments for blind and partially sighted people. It could be as simple as kind of colour contrasting on a keyboard or on a till or something like that. And I think it's the unknown for a lot of managers, and that doesn't mean that once you engage with them that they're not open to it, but a lot of the time it's the individual with the disability or with the visual impairment in our case that's got to know the solution, and they don't always know that. So one example which I can give was from a couple of years ago. We worked with an individual who'd got a job at Sainsbury's, and had disclosed his disability, but was unable to do certain tasks on the shop floor as quickly as his colleagues. Now, the way that he could speed that up was by using a handheld magnifier. However, his line manager was saying that he couldn't use it because it didn't look professional, and he wasn't able. He just was stopping him from using it. It was also the same with you operating the till. He was slower than his colleagues because he wasn't able to use his handheld magnifier. Now, fortunately, this individual had contacted us and told us about the problems, and we were able to advise him. But this was the day before a disciplinary meeting, where he was due to lose his job because his performance wasn't up to scratch. And then the reason why his performance wasn't up to scratch is because he'd been denied using the technology that he needed to be able to perform the job well. Now, we got involved. We spoke to Sainsbury's. We spoke to the HR department, highlighted what was going on. That disciplinary meeting was cancelled and rearranged. There was a different meeting which took place with a member of the HR team and the line manager. It was all explained, the support was put in place, and 3 months later, when I caught up with the individual, he was absolutely flying, and was actually going for a store manager role. So it's very clear to see that if a line manager is unwilling or unaware of the support that an individual needs and actually denies them using that technology, it can really impact people being able to retain their employment and then progress within their employment as well.
Thanks, Martin. Daniel, a very striking example, Daniel.
Unfortunately, we've heard of a lot of examples where employers are just unwilling to make reasonable adjustments for whatever reason. And I mean, one of the main concerns we've had is a lot of our stories have come from within the NHS itself, which is massively concerning when you consider that the NHS should be one of the employers that understands disability better than others. We've had a lot of examples of people who've been moved from frontline services once they start having seizures to other areas of the business, and they feel sidelined when actually the reasonable adjustments for people with epilepsy are fairly minimal. Would involve things as simple as providing a rest area for people once they've had a seizure, or just a bit more flexible working hours if people are more likely to have seizures early in the morning. Just that being a bit more flexible and changing working hours can help massively. But unfortunately, we hear all too often the reluctance of employers to make even those simple changes. But we know from good examples of the difference that kind of those adjustments can make. We've worked with a lot of employers locally and nationally to provide training on epilepsy. And when they undertake that training and understand the condition a bit more and how minimal those reasonable adjustments are, that makes a huge difference. And employers are more likely to implement those reasonable adjustments if they've had just a little bit of training from ourselves.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. And having represented workers with epilepsy, trying to explain to managers what needs to be done around reasonable adjustments. I fully agree with what you're saying. Now, Rob, you had given some excellent suggestions there about what the government could do, but I think my question to you is, what needs to be done to ensure that the part of the Equality Act, which covers reasonable adjustments, is suitably enforced? Because I think that there's an enforcement issue here, is there not?
There is absolutely an enforcement issue, and I think the vagueness and the fuzziness of reasonable adjustments is actually a part of the enforcement problem. I don't think the deaf people we support understand where the line is and how far they can push an employer. I think, can I give one example of enforcement that I think really illustrates just how bad it is at times? Is that we're aware of a lot of people who are given an assessment by Access to Work, which may include an employer cost share, or may say that before Access to Work steps in, an employer should make certain reasonable adjustments. And we do get a lot of people who have that assessment, their employer has been given those recommendations, and they just refuse to do it. An employer, even when Access to Work says this is a reasonable adjustment, or this is the cost share you should make, will just say no. And if they do so, they seem to be able to do it with impunity. That individual can't challenge their employer, they're not given the course, and Access to Work won't enforce it. And it might be a relatively small group of people that affects, but as an illustration of just how easy it is for employers to abdicate their responsibility, I actually think it's quite a powerful example.
Yeah, Rob, indeed. And again, I apologies, Chair, but it's taken me back to my trade union past, even a few years ago. Martin, Daniel, is there anything you would want to say to the committee in relation to how we can enforce the Equalities Act, particularly in relation to reasonable adjustments?
I think one of the key issues that we would... Oh, sorry.
No, Daniel, please go ahead.
One of the key issues we would like to see is kind of giving employees confidence to know when they're being discriminated against. Our research has identified that actually a lot of people don't know where the line is in terms of discrimination and don't have the confidence to challenge their employers when they are being discriminated against. And in terms of reasonable adjustments, one simple thing we would like to see is the introduction of timescales. So putting the pressure on employers to provide a timescale for when those reasonable adjustments will be implemented. Because far too often we see long delays that then cause frustration for the employee, and it kind of feels like they're being forced out of the business in kind of a backhanded way.
Yeah, Martin?
Yeah, I think the main area where we see issues around reasonable adjustments and where we'd like to see that it be, greater kind of support for the individual would be when they're looking at retaining their employment. So when they have a degenerative eye condition and they've previously been working in a role, and then the employer is unwilling to make the adjustments to enable them to retain that employment where it's possible. It's really difficult for somebody who's recently lost the sight to understand what reasonable is, and then when they feel that they're not being treated fairly, to bring any kind of action against their employer in it. It's such a kind of complicated and overwhelming process for somebody to do that. And it's something that as an organisation we struggle with as well, is, well, how can we challenge more employers when we know that they aren't doing what they should be doing under the Equalities Act?
Thanks. So my next question is, how effective is Access to Work and retaining people into work and getting people into work? Let's start with yourself, Rob.
So I do not want to overdo it, but I think we sometimes overlook just how transformative Access to Work has been. I think talked to British Sign Language users, a slightly older generation to myself, and they saw their working opportunities completely limited, often to sort of low ends of the labour market. So it has completely transformed some people's ability to do their jobs and to have a career and to have aspirations. So I don't think we should lose sight of the good stuff within Access to Work. I do think we have a lot of concerns, and we get a lot of inquiries and evidence that too often the system just doesn't work as it's supposed to. I've already mentioned before the problem with reasonable adjustments and how Access to Work recommendations don't have to be implemented by employers. We also, time and time again, find that advisors don't necessarily understand the disability or the solutions they're proposing for people. A big one for us is the compatibility of assistive tech. So access to work will make recommendations around the piece of equipment without any knowledge of whether it's compatible with the office equipment the individual uses, and for our beneficiaries, whether it's compatible with their hearing aids. And often they get given a piece of equipment that's worthless. And I think the big key here is about empowering the disabled person and the deaf person to co-design their package of support. People know the support they use, they know the support they can access in many cases, and they should be empowered to do that. But often access to work tells them the support they need. And indeed, actually, within the guidance that advisors and assessors get, they're told not to pay too much preference to the individual's needs and wants. And I just think that's completely contrary to the design of good disability policy. It should be a co-production where the individual is allowed to understand and implement the support they get in the workplace.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. Martin, I think Rob has a point. Isn't the biggest challenge here with access to work is that employers sometimes ignore the recommendations from access to work, or there's a reluctance to put the funding in that access to work would ask an employer to do?
I'd say for blind and partially sighted people, it's actually getting the right assessment and the right advice for the equipment that they need to be able to do the job. We run an internship program at Thomas Pocklington Trust where we offer entry-level roles specifically to the blind and partially sighted people. And I get involved in the access to work process quite a lot with those individuals, and it's amazing the lack of knowledge which turns up when the assessment's been done. And our interns are often inexperienced within the workplace. They don't necessarily know the equipment that they're going to need. Now, fortunately, they have me on hand, who's an experienced member of staff who's worked in the sight loss sector, who also has a visual impairment, to be able to help them through that. Now, if they were placed within an organisation that didn't have that specialism, that individual would be really struggling, and the assessor wouldn't be able to help them. And then, an employer might be willing to put in the money, but then the equipment turns up and it doesn't work with their systems. It isn't right for that individual, and then you have a hell of a job to go back and go, well, actually, we need this, we didn't need that, because the assessment's been done and you've signed it off all in good faith that you think that an expert's turned up and done that assessment, and that's right. So actually, I'd say that more specialism in the assessors that are working with these individuals. You can fight to get a specialist company to come and do your assessment for you if you're blind and partially sighted, but that's a hell of a battle, and it isn't something which is offered as kind of standard for any blind or partially sighted person. Also, I'd like to see, it's something which Access to Work are looking into, but kind of passports as well. So when you move from job to job, that there's an acceptance that there will be certain pieces of equipment which, as a blind and partially sighted person, you are going to need no matter the job that you do. So for me, as a blind person, I know that I could leave TPT tomorrow and go and work for another organisation, and I'm going to need a text-to-speech text-to-speech software.
Yeah.
And Access to Work should know that, because I've spent the last 15 years working and I've always needed that. I'd have to do another assessment and put in another claim, which could take up to 3 months to get that piece of equipment to start the new job. So, if there was a passport in place where I could just go, look, that I've had this before, I'm still blind, can we just sign this off immediately? I can get it, and then I can hit the ground running with my employer. That's going to be really kind of beneficial as well. So I think the assessment processes and how you then have to navigate Access to Work as an individual once you've had an initial assessment done and subsequent moving on to roles is kind of more important to the individual. I think that's a bigger issue than employers maybe not implementing the recommendations which have been made, because I don't have an awful lot of evidence to back that up for blind and partially sighted people. So.
Thanks, Martin. Very comprehensive. Before I pass back to the chair,
Thank you.
Daniel, do you have anything on Access to Work and effectiveness?
I mean, generally speaking, access to work is a fantastic scheme, but there are some issues that people with epilepsy have experienced, particularly delays in getting reasonable adjustments implemented. We've heard of delays up to 6 to 9 months to get those reasonable adjustments in place, and that causes frustration for both the employer and the employee, and it can just lead to a further breakdown in that relationship. And another issue that kind of we want to have looked at in terms of access to work is making it available during the job search as well, because that would help disabled people get into work, and then make sure that those reasonable adjustments are in place once they start their employment as well.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Back to you, Chair.
Thank you. Dr. Ben Spencer.
Thank you. You've spoken a lot about the need to educate and support employers. I mean, isn't this what the Disability Confidence Scheme's about? And how do you think that's working?
Happy to start again. I think we've always appreciated the intention of the Disability Confidence Scheme, and we see what it's trying to achieve. But I don't actually think there's enough within that scheme to make it achieve what it wants to do. I think if you look at the steps that employers, especially at the bottom of the three bands, of those that are committed, they don't actually need to do anything. They just need to sign up and say they will do something in the future, and it gives that false impression. I think there's no information provision, particularly within Disability Confident, and I've mentioned before the case for an employment hub, which just isn't there. And I think actually even the DWP's own research, when they sort of evaluated the scheme, I think it was sort of 2018, the last time they did this, showed that the biggest action those organisations that had signed up to Disability Confident were doing was to promote they were a disability competent organisation. Other actions, I think, sort of things like changing recruitment practices, I think was the most common, and only around 10-15% of organisations were doing that as a result of signing up to Disability Confident. And there are lots of disability confident organisations, including disability confident leaders, who say they haven't hired a single disabled person as a result of signing up to Disability Confident. And I think there is the intention of Disability Confident is right. It shines a light on the biggest problem, employer attitudes, but there just doesn't seem to be enough within that scheme to make the difference that it should, particularly, if I can say so, given the emphasis that I think the government put on Disability Confident as part of the solution and part of the way in which they will close the disability employment gap.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would echo a lot of what Rob said as well. And in fact, I think there's only about 20,000 employers signed up to Disability Confident. And the commitments involved, they don't go far enough. The commitments as part of Disability Confident is what we'd expect any good employer to be doing. You could reach the highest level of Disability Confident without having hired a single disabled person. And that should be kind of a given, really, to get to the highest level of Disability Confident. So we'd like to see those commitments strengthened significantly, and I think that would help to kind of improve the overall vision of Disability Confident and hopefully encourage more employers to sign up to it, because at the moment the take-up is quite low, and it needs to be communicated more, and the benefits of it need to be communicated more to small and medium-sized enterprises.
Thanks, Martin. Do you have anything to add?
I'd just say that I think Disability Confident, while well-intentioned, isn't providing employers with the information that they need to be confident in employing disabled people. I also don't think that the scheme is particularly great at linking employers with organisations like TPT. I have carried out training with disability confident leaders that we've kind of approached off our own back and spent a full half day explaining the assistive tech that a blind and partially sighted person can use within their workplace. Now, these people are disability confident leaders, and there's members of staff that this was new information to. So there's definitely some sort of breakdown between somebody becoming a disability confident leader and that information of how they can support different disabilities being passed down throughout members of staff within that organisation.
Thanks. We've heard a bit about, on this panel and on previous panels, how one of the metrics of success of disability confidence should be that someone with a disability has been recruited. Is there a danger that if this was brought in terms of one of the measurable outcomes, that might disincentivise some companies from getting involved? Because if at the end of the day they end up not employing someone with a disability for whatever reason, they might be scrutinised for not having done so. So what's your take on any unintended consequences of using data as a metric of success?
Sorry, if it's okay to go again. I understand the point, and I think I understand why the barriers of entry to the scheme for the committed levels, so the bottom of the 3 levels, are so low. I think the issue we have is that any organisation that's joined the committed is able to display the disability competent logo, and I think that gives the wrong impression. I think if you're going to have a very low barrier to entry, then there should be a bit more scrutiny of who can claim to be a disability competent employer. Those committed employers don't do the things that we would expect a disability competent employer to do, and they certainly don't do the things that a member of the 2-tick scheme, which disability competent has largely replaced, would undertake. So I think if you want very low barriers of entry at the entry point of the scheme, you need to make sure that's not allowing employers to give false impressions to prospective members of staff.
Thanks.
I'd just say that I'd say that would have to be one metric in a series of metrics which disability confident employers would kind of have to report on, and it wouldn't necessarily be that, I think it'd be important to go, look, we know that there is X amount of disabled people, and maybe not every single employer who is disability confident at that point or in that year or that reporting year will have recruited somebody who's disabled. But if they can confidently kind of say, but we have had our recruitment process looked at by a sight loss organisation looking at our perspective, and we know that our recruitment process, our online application process is accessible, then that's, that also is as important as that overall metric which you're saying of a disabled person getting a job. I think it's if an employer can demonstrate that the opportunities for disabled people to get employed within that organisation are there, and that's being demonstrated as part of disability confident, that's as important from my perspective as if they are getting a disabled person into work. That has obviously always got to be the end goal, but it's not the only determining factor over whether an employer can say that they're disability confident, because, as I said earlier, if a blind or partially sighted person can't fill out their application form online, and I have seen examples of this with disability confident leaders, how can they say they're a disability confident leader when a blind or partially sighted person can't complete an application form? So I think that one metric which you mentioned is important, but there needs to be other ones as well in place.
And so some of the problem, I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but from what I'm hearing, some of the problem is the self-certification nature of the scheme is problematic. There needs to be a sort of, I see Daniel, everyone's nodding, there needs to be an objective assessor in a sense for it to work better. Okay, that's great. I'm conscious of time. I'll hand back over to the Chair.
Thank you very much, and that completes our questions to you. Thank you all very much for joining us this morning and for the very helpful answers you've given us, which we will certainly draw on as we move to putting together the conclusions from our inquiry. Thank you, and we welcome the second panel now to join us. Thank you to all of you. I think you've been with us through that first session as well, so you've heard the discussion that we've had. Can I ask each of you just very briefly to introduce yourselves to us, starting with Sarah Rawlings.
Hello, I'm Sarah Rawlings. I'm Executive Director of Research and External Affairs at the Multiple Sclerosis Society.
Thank you. And Catherine Hale.
Hi, I'm Catherine Hale. I'm the founder and director of Chronic Illness Inclusion, a small disabled people's organisation for people with energy-limiting chronic illness. I'm having to do this session reclining here today because it helps with my cognitive fatigue and dysfunction. So just to explain that.
Thank you. Thank you very much for being with us. And Professor Karen Walker-Bone.
Good morning, everyone. I'm a Professor of Occupational Rheumatology at the University of Southampton. Today I'm representing Versus Arthritis, the leading UK charity for people with musculoskeletal disorders. It's a really difficult term to explain because most people don't know what a musculoskeletal disorder is, but things ranging from arthritis and osteoporosis through to lupus, back pain, fibromyalgia, those sorts of things.
Thank you. Thank you all. So can I put the first question to you all? As you'll know, the current government target is to get 1 million more disabled people into work by 2027. The previous target was to halve the disability employment gap. Can I ask each of you, which you think is better, and what are the strengths and weaknesses of those two different approaches to a target in this area? Start with Sarah Rawlings, if we can.
It is important to measure the number of people that are getting into work. However, I think the disability employment gap perhaps provides a better opportunity to look at things like how many people are remaining in work and measure that as well. Many people with multiple sclerosis, for example, have symptoms during the peak of their working lives, and 8 in 10 leave or retire within 15 years of their diagnosis. The disability employment gap in some research we've done seems to be bigger than the average. So we're really keen that the government look at measures that include retention and not just those people that are actually coming into work. It's also really important to have an impairment group or condition-specific disability employment gap measure. This is really important so that we're able to focus support where it's actually most needed. And there are other indicators as well that are very important and should be measured. For example, quality of jobs, disability pay gaps, job satisfaction gaps, and also things like career progression should be measured, which we know is really important to a lot of disabled people, including those with MS.
Thank you. Catherine Hale.
Yes, we also agree, obviously, it's very important for government to have a target. We do agree that that measuring the disability employment gap is a more meaningful measure than trying to get 1 million disabled people into work, because we know that measure could be influenced by how disabled people are reporting disability or not, and by demographic changes within society and the labour market. We also would like to see government set targets and develop measures for preventing people from falling out of work when they become disabled. And as previous speakers have said, we would like to see mandatory reporting by employers of the number of disabled employees and their pay rates in companies of a certain size. We would like to see the outcomes of government's disability employment programmes more transparent and more held to account. The programmes run by private contractors, and particularly for them to be benchmarked against the numbers of disabled people that move into work without these interventions. And I'd also agree with the previous speaker that it's so important to measure, to have good data when looking at the disability employment gap on impairment types. And we use the term energy limiting chronic illness to group conditions together by their impact, especially their impact on employment. So we know from our research that that fatigue or energy limitation is the most predominant feature and the most work limiting feature among a broad range of conditions: neurological, musculoskeletal, autoimmune, as well as the obvious ME, fibromyalgia, and respiratory diseases. And of course we need to think about long COVID, which is affecting 1 million people now, and for which fatigue is the predominant feature. Unfortunately, we know from the data that DWP collects in the Family Resources Survey, we know that impairment of stamina, breathing or fatigue affects 1 in 3 disabled people. So it's a really broad group of people with a range of conditions that have a similar impact on their ability to work. But unfortunately, in the labour force survey, where the data on the disability employment gap is found, the typology, if you like, of impairment is different to the Family Resources Survey, and there's not that category that looks at energy impairment, stamina and fatigue. And instead it's divided up by which body systems are affected or by diagnosis, which is a kind of an outdated medical model way of looking at disability in groups of disabled people. So we would like to see the data collected within the labour force survey to be redesigned so that it has that broader category of energy limiting chronic illness, so that we can really see the numbers of people affected in this way and find solutions to help them into work.
Thank you. And that is in the Family Resources Survey, is it?
Yes, so within the Family Resources Survey, they use a typology of impairment that's recommended by the Office for National Statistics, and one of those categories is an impairment of stamina, breathing or fatigue. And as I said, it's actually the third largest group of disabled people of working age. So it's a really important category to use because it tells you about the impact of someone's condition, not just the diagnosis. But it's not used within the labour force survey, which we think is a really, is a really missing opportunity to collect that data and have that bigger picture.
Right. Thank you very much. Professor Walker-Bone.
Sure, I share everybody's view that measuring this gap is vital. There's no question that we're highlighting a really key issue and missing a massive talent pool by excluding disabled people from our workplaces. I guess what I also want to draw attention to is working is generally good for people's health. Most people with musculoskeletal disorders tell us they want to work. We know they're financially better off for working, but probably some of their symptoms are better controlled as well by being in the workplace. And of course, financially, it's much easier to be earning your own money and to be responsible for how you spend it than to be dependent on the benefit system. So that's all I want to say on that.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. Dr. Ben Spencer.
Thank you. I think in part, actually, my sort of line of question has been covered, but I just want to go back to just to see if there's any other bits to cover. It's around the quality of the data in terms of people with neurological, musculoskeletal and energy limiting chronic illnesses in work. And I'm very interested in your point about focusing on symptoms and impairments rather than the diagnosis itself, which I completely get what you're saying in terms of that. It's more useful in terms of that disconnect. Are there areas where more data is needed? And if so, how are they better collected?
Who wants to start?
I'm very happy to start.
Please do.
I think one of the areas I'd like to see much better data is from access to work. We know it's a very underutilised service. More than 50% of people with musculoskeletal disorders have never heard of it. So it needs better promotion, and they've committed to do so. But we need some metrics to understand if it's working. We need some data about who's using it, but also the nature of the conditions and disabilities they're supporting, and also whether it's enabling work retention. Because at the end of the day, that's what it's all for, and we have no data to tell us whether it's working.
I would just add that what both Catherine and I have mentioned around impairment specific and condition specific employment measures gap measures are really, really important. It's really the way that we're going to be able to tailor employment support better, but also overall figures around disability employment do mask a very heterogeneous group of people with very different challenges and contexts, and they will require very tailored solutions, which is why it's so important to really kind of move this on so that people do get the support they need, both to access work, but to also stay in work.
Thank you.
Yes, so I'll just go back to, obviously I've made the point already. What I'd like to add is that it would help to have a standardised typology of impairment used across all the different policy areas, from social care, employment support to disability benefits. And we approve of the one recommended by the Office for National Statistics, which includes this category of impairment of stamina, breathing or fatigue. We would prefer it to be termed energy impairment or energy limiting chronic illness, because this is closer to how people with lived experience of these conditions would like to describe or have their conditions understood. But generally we think that there's a problem, that there's a different typology of impairment across different areas, and that it should be standardised, and it would be much more helpful then to to apply policy solutions across the board.
Thank you. Just on that point, just in terms of just doing it by trying to get sort of a thematic approach to different types of impairments or symptoms, I just wonder how that would work in practice, because take my experience in terms of looking after people with psychosis, one of the things that tends not to be picked up, and it's very difficult to explain, is what's known as some of the negative symptoms of schizophrenia, where people are demotivated, and often that can be misinterpreted as people being, by people who don't understand or have experience with managing the condition, that people are just being lazy, when actually it's a part of the illness, apathy and demotivation, and how you sort of differentiate that from the very different type of sort of fatigue that you see in things like chronic fatigue syndrome, and the very different type of lack of energy that you see, let's say, in someone who's got chronic depression versus someone who's got chronic renal impairment, versus someone who's got chronic inflammatory disease and driven by arthritis. I'm just wondering how that works in practice in terms of separating this out. And the amount of training, I think, in terms of people who would be doing these assessments and needing to understand the detail of a range of symptomatologies for a range of different conditions. I mean, I wonder if there's consequences to taking that approach. I'm interested in your thoughts.
I guess I'll go first. I think that's a very, very interesting question. And obviously fatigue, or we use the term energy impairment to convey that we're talking about an objective loss of function. There's a problem with the term fatigue. People feel that it describes a subjective kind of sensation of something that you can push through, as opposed to an impairment or a loss of function. Obviously, there's different, as you say, within different diseases, the biology of fatigue is different, the quality of fatigue is different, and that's very important. And so it is important to hear from, mental health groups on that type of fatigue, as well as the type of fatigue in kidney disease, fatigue in long COVID. There will be subtle differences, but we found from our research that there are also astonishing, actually, number of similarity of the way that this impacts on work capability. So that's why we think that it is useful to take this broader focus, so that you don't miss the bigger picture and the kinds of difficulties that people have in work and the solutions that could help them.
Thanks, that's very helpful. And Professor Morgan.
Sure, thank you. It's a really important question, and you put your finger on it with mental health and MSDs being great examples of how variable the degree of impairment actually is. And I think what we've been stuck with this word disability, and this word disability encompasses people with long-term health conditions, a huge variety of symptoms, and yet most people think of it as somebody in a wheelchair. So I think we've seen some fantastic examples today of how variable disability is. If you think about the word, it means lack of ability, and that's how we should be treating it. For me, to solve the problem about working, we should be looking what people can do and making jobs as suitable for their needs as possible. Actually, what label we've given the disease, the medicalisation of it's unhelpful completely as far as I'm concerned. I think those of us in medicine are probably allowed to say that. I think sometimes that's unhelpful. It's about the symptomatology, the functional impairments to do what you need to do for that job. And it's about having more available, more jobs that could give the flexibility and understand the needs of the individuals. And I think we need a culture shift in this country towards jobs that are made for people. All workers need flexible jobs. All workers need to be treated well by their employer. And we should be praising employers who do that well and working towards a country where we offer good jobs that are suitable for the needs of the people doing those jobs.
Thank you. Ms. Rawlings, any other points on this topic?
Like the previous speakers, I think it is a really important question. I think, their answers have covered it extremely well. Disability is incredibly variable. Even within multiple sclerosis, there are a range of different symptoms. It's an incredibly unpredictable condition that affects each individual in a very different way. And we do need that culture shift to better understand different conditions and symptoms that people experience, so that we're better able to tailor the support in a really good way.
Thank you very much. Debbie Abrahams.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, everyone. I'm going to declare an interest. I was diagnosed with severe arthritis at the end of 2016, so I can talk about my own experience within the workplace, in Parliament, and the support or lack thereof that I received. But I'm very interested to hear from all of the speakers, if I may, in terms of what they feel the barriers to remaining in work and also to accessing work for people with neurological, musculoskeletal and energy limiting chronic conditions are. Sarah, do you want to kick off?
Sure. I think I mentioned in a previous answer to a question that most people with multiple sclerosis experience their symptoms in the peak of their working lives, and 8 in 10 will retire or leave within 15 years of their diagnosis. The condition is very different and unpredictable for everyone. But in many cases, with the right support and a supportive employer, people can remain in work. And I think often the root of the problem is around a lack of understanding. For instance, many employers, as we heard in the previous session, do want to do the right thing, but they may not know enough about how they can actually support their employee, including the support schemes that may be available to them, or the reasonable adjustments that may need to be made and can be put in place. Last week was actually MS Awareness Week, so we're really keen to push this point around the importance of awareness, an understanding of the impact of MS, what support can be provided to employees, but also what support is available to the employer as well. Unfortunately, people with MS don't always work in an environment where they feel that they can raise this awareness themselves, and we undertook a recent survey around talking about MS, and it found that a quarter of people felt least confident talking about how it impacts on their work. 33% said they kept their MS a secret from their employer. 40% said they kept their MS from their employer because they were worried about how it would affect their career, and a similar number kept it from their employer because they were worried about discrimination. So this awareness point is incredibly important. However, there are also wider societal challenges that prevent people from getting into and also staying in work. For example, people with multiple sclerosis and other health conditions rely on other means of support as well. For example, it could be from the social care system to actually enable them to get up and ready for work in the morning. And if we don't have these types of things in place as well, access to accessible transport, etc., then we're really struggling to kind of help people to both access work and remain in work as well.
Thank you, Sarah. Catherine, do you want to share your experience? And
yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. Our research has found that the barriers to work are a kind of complex interaction between health factors and social barriers. And it's important to spell out the health factors with energy limiting chronic illness, because they're so often disbelieved, misunderstood and dismissed. So energy impairment, as we said, is different from universal experience of fatigue. It means that if you have a very limited amount of energy, just the act of washing and dressing might mean that you have no energy left to travel to work, let alone get through a working day. So overall, energy impairment limits the amount of work people can do more than the type of work people can do. And this is so important to get across, I think, that we're talking about limitation in the number of hours people can do in any week reliably and repeatedly. Cognitive fatigue is probably the most overlooked aspect of energy limiting chronic illness. We're talking about brain fog and dysfunction such as concentration issues, short-term memory, communication, and about, again, the duration of concentration people can sustain. And this is possibly the most significant issue in relation to work. Fluctuation is something that there has been awareness of, and obviously it's a huge barrier to work if you can't predict when you're going to be able to perform in the workplace, when you're going to be available. That has a massive knock-on effect on an organisation that needs to, align deadlines and targets. And if as an individual you can't fulfil those targets, that's obviously a big barrier to employability. In terms of structural barriers from within the labour market, there's really a lack of suitable jobs to match with people's capacities. So many people energy limiting chronic illness would love to have a job that was less than 16 hours a week, for example, because that's all that they would be able to give in terms of energy to employment. But there are so little job offers in place that go beyond the standard full-time or even the standard part-time hours for people with limited hours of work. Management styles within work we found are really important, can be either enabling or disabling. So when kind of presence in the workplace and hours are given more importance than performance and output, that puts huge barriers in place to people having the flexibility they need to manage a fluctuating condition and get adjustments like working from home or reducing their hours. And I think, as other previous speakers have said, lack of awareness and understanding of energy limiting chronic illness and energy impairment, as well as being a form of hidden impairment, there's the stigma that people face, the stigma of disbelief. We found that in our research, there's often a huge barrier to even disclosing disability in the workplace because fatigue is so often dismissed as a universal thing that you just have to pull yourself together, push through, don't be lazy. So it takes a very long time for people to feel they're even entitled to identify as disabled. And then there's the lack of understanding among employers, so negotiating the adjustments that they may need to remain in work. The barriers to achieving that mean that so many people are falling out of the workplace when they acquire an energy limiting chronic illness because they don't have the confidence and there's not the employer awareness to negotiate those adjustments that may have kept them in work.
Very comprehensive. Thank you very much, Catherine. And now on to Karen.
Libby, first of all, thank you for sharing your story, and I'm really sorry to hear about your experiences. As you know yourself, the main problems with having a musculoskeletal condition are pain and fatigue, mobility and stamina, as we've been hearing, and also needing time off for treatment and diagnosis and all the various appointments that we make you have and blood monitoring and all the rest of it. And I think what most people are telling us is that they find their employer poorly equipped to give them the flexibility that they need, particularly in the early phases of diagnosis of an inflammatory condition. You need a lot of appointments and a lot of monitoring, but actually the prognosis can be really good. But the employer's kind of on their fixed system of, well, after your 3 months of not coming in, I'm going to tell you off, and after 6 months, I'm going to think about making you redundant. And there's not that understanding that time would enable you to be back to normal. I have to say, I've been listening to all the different speakers this morning, thinking about the nature of all the different impairments that people can have. And if you're an employer of 20 people, suddenly you've got someone who's got sight loss or hearing loss or arthritis. We're expecting an awful lot of them. And I think what is coming to me is that we must give people better support to enable them to support their employees. Dare I say it, even some kind of incentivisation, because actually this is hard. How are they going to know? One of my stories was of a porter working in a hospital who took his mother for her chemotherapy during her last illness every day. On the last day, the day she died, he rang in and said, I don't think I can come in today. And his line manager said, well, all right then, but you better be in tomorrow. Now, line managers and porters in hospitals aren't highly qualified. They're not very empathic. They've got into a role they don't really understand, and they feel they've just got to meet their targets. That's what it's all about. And we understand that. We really need a different way of doing this.
Thank you so much, Karen. Well, following on from that, could you build on that? We've identified the barriers and you've started to identify potential solutions and also the issues particularly that employers face. So what do you think that employers, recognising the different types of employees, the different sizes of employers, what can they do more to keep people in work and then, as I say, also to encourage people with these conditions into work? Start with Karen.
Thank you. So the main thing to point out here is that we know, certainly with musculoskeletal conditions, the nearer to the workplace you are, the more likely we'll be able to get you back to work. So if someone's been off for 6 months with back pain, they have a 50% chance of ever working again. After a year, it drops away to less than 20%. So at the moment, it seems to me that we've put a lot of resource into the people who've been out of the workplace for 2 years or more, rather than, as has been mentioned by many other speakers, investing in retaining them in the workplace or close to the workplace while we support them through their diagnosis phase and their getting their management better established phase. This is hard, and I think Access to Work has the right principles at stake, but it needs a bigger voice, it needs to be better monitored, it needs to be better promoted, and it needs to become the authoritative place to turn that employers can go to. This idea of a hub, an online hub, let's link it all to Access to Work, and let's make it possible for us to see who's accessing the help, why they're not accessing the help, which kinds of conditions it's catering well for, which ones it's not, and then how can we improve it going forward.
Thanks, Karen. Catherine?
Yeah, so obviously the Equality Act places a duty on employers to make reasonable adjustments. We think is, probably the key lever that's already there in place to support and retain people in employment. And but what I think what employers lack understanding of is that reasonable adjustments are often perceived as being about changes to the physical environment or expensive pieces of equipment. But actually, with energy limiting chronic illness, the most effective adjustments that people need to remain in work are changes to the timing of work, as we said, reduction in hours, changes to the pace of work, so that they're given more flexibility to complete tasks in managing fluctuating condition and completing tasks in the time frame that works for them, and also in the place of work. So, you know, working from home is a huge adjustment that enables many people with energy limiting chronic illness to work. And so often before the pandemic, when people asked for this adjustment, they were told, no, it's not possible, we can't have you working from home. You know, it doesn't work. And we've seen through the pandemic that, you know, within a matter of weeks, the whole nation was working from home, and it was absolutely doable, and the technology's there for remote working. So actually it's a good news story, because reasonable adjustments are about working from home, having more control over your hours, flexible work, and I think there's just a lack of awareness among employers that's sometimes just what it takes to keep disabled people in work. We do need better mechanisms to enforce the Equality Act, because at the moment the onus is all on the individual, and it's an enormous burden when you're in a conflictual relationship with an employer to take it to to take it to that stage. So we would like to see better mechanisms to enforce the duty for reasonable adjustments. Education and training on energy limiting chronic illnesses across the board for managers, so that they understand the difference between fatigue, normal everyday tiredness and fatigue, and energy impairment, and all the features that are associated, the cognitive fatigue, the fluctuation, the payback, so that for every activity that you do, that there is a kind of a recuperation time that's needed, so that they're able to support employers with the right adjustments. We do think, I think going what other speakers have said, access to work is hugely important, and if employers, I believe only 25% of employers were aware of it in a survey by Centre for Social Justice. So promoting awareness of access to work among employers would mean that they were able to get that support in place for their employees and support and work together in the process. And something we might come to later is we think there's a really important role for government to promote job creation of certain types or niche types of job for people with chronic illness. And perhaps I'll speak a bit more about that later when we come to commissioning and employment support.
Thank you. And finally, Sarah, on this particular.
Yeah, I very much agree with what's been said, and I think a key theme that's coming through is that around information and support for employers, and we're very keen on this one-stop shop or this information hub idea, because if we could provide all the information in one place that's easy to access, that is all the information that people need. For example, understanding legal duties under the Equalities Act, understanding what regional adjustments can be made, that it doesn't have to cost a lot of money sometimes, and access to work does exist. That is really, really important. But I think we'd also like to see, as been mentioned as well, improvements to schemes such as access to work, both in how it is publicised so that people actually know about it, but also when and how it's used. So, for example, it being available earlier than when you're actually in a role, because it can take some time for regional adjustments to then come into play. And also, the fact that came up in the previous session as well, that you can't take your access to work to another job if you move jobs. You have to go through the process again. I think just some tweaks like that or changes like that could make a real difference in both the confidence of the employee and the employer, and could make a huge difference in actually getting people into work and remaining in work as well.
Thank you, Sarah. And just I think we've meshed a little bit with the final question I was going to ask. So perhaps if we can just limit it to one thing. In relation to what government can do, particularly the Department for Work and Pensions, could you all mention one thing, whether it's a new policy or whether it's amplifying an existing policy or programme, whether it's in relation to employment support? What more do we need to do to help people with these conditions remain in work that can be done by these departments?
Could I go first, Debbie, and
yeah,
say
sure.
what I think I'd like is to see DWP working more closely with DHSC and more closely with EIS, so we have a joined-up approach to how we're going to manage this. They can't do it on their own. They're basically picking up when it's all gone wrong. It's too late. We need when a health condition's been diagnosed, or indeed when health symptoms are presenting, for the sort of care and support to be put in place, and for the management to be trained and supported to help.
Very helpful. Thank you, Karen. Catherine?
Yes, it's really difficult to choose just one thing. I think, as other speakers have said, the integration of access to work with other forms of employment support is absolutely crucial. But one thing I'd like to flag up is that we'd like to see government and contractors more involved in job brokering and job creation, so supporting employers to tailor their job offers and create niche roles that may be less than 16 hours a week and may have the flexibility and the working from home provision that would, and cut out some of the unnecessary duties from a kind of standardised job role. There's a what we call an invisible talent pool of people with chronic illness who would love to work if the right kind of role was available, and job carving is something that's been that's known in relation to learning disabilities and works effectively, and we think that concept of job carving and that agencies are needed to work with employers to carve out those roles. We think that that's a really important solution for people with energy limiting chronic illness.
Thanks so much, Catherine. Oops.
Yeah.
And finally, Sarah, sorry.
No problem. Yeah, it's very, very difficult to choose just one thing, and I think we've all spoken about a range of different options and possibilities today. I would just like to add in the importance of tailoring what's provided, and also ensuring that what we provide is also person-centred, and a lot of that is to do with that we're actually working very closely with disabled people on the schemes that are in place and what is being discussed. That is absolutely integral to ensure that we really do get this right.
Thank you so much, everyone. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you, Debbie, very much. Steve McCabe.
Thanks. Good morning. I want to ask specifically about local employment support, and I wonder if I can start with Sarah. I noticed that the MS are keen advocates of localised employment support. I think you say delivered by local authorities and charities, which you say would deliver better employment outcomes for disabled people. And I know there's quite a lot of support for that view, but my own understanding is that the evidence for the claim is a bit thin. So I just wondered how you came to this view and what you think the benefits are, Sarah.
Absolutely. I think what we hear from people with and affected by multiple sclerosis is that a one-size-fits-all approach doesn't work, and there is perhaps more of an opportunity to build a local, more holistic model to support people with MS to find quality work and remaining work. And really, when we're thinking about that, we're thinking about how local agencies can work together to tackle various barriers that people have to employment. And that could include things such as access to inclusive transport, the social care support that I raised earlier as well. And there is perhaps more of an opportunity to engage with disabled people for their own views and experiences at a local level. And also support delivered by local providers can perhaps provide an opportunity of an understanding of the local employment market, and can build really meaningful relationships with employers, so we know who's out there and who really wants to work on this, is keen to do so. I think the disability strategy actually provides a very good opportunity for us to ensure that employment support is holistic and tackles the various barriers that exist for disabled people. But our approach is really, we're keen to ensure that there isn't a postcode lottery, but if we can tie up these local agencies working together, the experience for the disabled person may be improved than if things are always dealt with at a national level.
Okay, thank you. And Karen, does your organisation take the same view?
You know, I think it's a really hard one, isn't it? I can see a huge advantage to joining up transport, housing, social care and healthcare with employment, and I can see that being a really good way forward. But then I started to think about health inequalities, and we know there are patches of the country where, well, COVID's just shown it all, hasn't it? We've got people who are much more vulnerable, lower educational attainment, there are poorer jobs in their areas. Is it going to widen health inequalities if we have everything locally provided? It would have to be ring-fenced funding that genuinely went to the needy, and I don't know how you do that on a fair basis across the nation, but that would aspirationally be really good.
Okay, that's helpful, thank you. And Catherine, does your project take a view on this issue of national commissioning versus localised support?
Yes, so for us, the division isn't so much local versus national. It's a division between small, not-for-profit specialist organisations who have that impairment-specific knowledge, and the larger national contractors who don't have the who work in a more pan disability, one-size-fits-all kind of way. So the organisations that we would like to promote are kind of small, not-for-profit organisations and services that are specifically geared to people with chronic illness. So an example is Astrid, which is the only charity of its kind in the UK that matches people with chronic illness with employers, and it fulfills that job brokering service that I was talking about earlier, that it supports employers to tailor their job offers and create specialised roles, and to understand the needs of people with chronic illness, and as well as supporting people with chronic illness to move closer to work. And Chronically Consulting is another service. It's a start-up organisation that coaches people with chronic illness on supporting them with disability disclosure and with awareness of reasonable adjustments, and helps them negotiate reasonable adjustments with their employer. And both of these are examples. They're not geographically local, but they're small and they're specialised, and they're at the moment locked out of the commissioning models that the department uses to commission disability employment support. And so their funding models are insecure and unsustainable because they're locked out of that commissioning system that favours the large national contractors. So yeah, for me it's not about being geographically local, but it's about being having the specialist knowledge, coming from the voluntary community sector, and being locked out of the commissioning cycle by the small scale.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Steve. Siobhan Bailey.
Thank you, and thank you to everyone for joining us. This is specifically to Professor Walker-Bone this morning. So you've said that the application process for access to work can act as a barrier to disabled people seeking support, and other disability organisations have also described the application as being bureaucratic and really time-consuming. I'd like to really know a lot more about what the department should be doing to sort of fix the scheme and fix those problems.
Thank you, Siobhan. I think it's interesting, actually, they have responded to the pandemic in a very constructive way, and I think hopefully this sort of more hybrid way of working could be a way forward for the future. I think we all know the DWP is under enormous pressure, isn't it? I imagine the providers of the Access to Work service are not necessarily hugely well paid and hugely well resourced themselves. They're just too far stretched. They don't mean to be delays. They don't want to be delays. They are slow to answer their phone, they are slow to answer their emails, and things take a long time from the perspective of the individual trying to get the support.
And anything... Oh, sorry, I think you probably answered that. So I've got another question. I'm sort of moving on. This is one for everybody. The government plans to publish the National Strategy for Disabled People. They're working on that at the moment, and a green paper on health and disability support. What would you like to see in those papers as a priority? I think if I can come to Catherine first.
Yes, we would like to see them consider people with energy limiting chronic illness as a large group of disabled people with their own set of needs and with specific sets of policy solutions. And we've been disappointed that the consultation itself the process of it has been really inadequate, lacking, there hasn't been, for example, enough time given to disabled people to respond to the survey that they put out, which is really disappointing. There hasn't been enough engagement, or I don't think any engagement at all with organisations, disabled people's organisations led by disabled people themselves. And there hasn't been engagement with disabled people's organisation for people with energy limiting chronic illness. So the process itself has been disappointing. We would like to see a focus on this particular impairment group, stamina, breathing and fatigue, seen as a coherent and large group of disabled people, because it's been previously kind of invisible and ignored as a group.
Catherine, sorry, Siobhan, I just wonder, Catherine, whether you could make your job creation point here, just to make sure we don't lose that, the point you mentioned a few minutes ago.
Yes, absolutely. We'd like to see the government work with the smaller employment support providers, such as Astrid, who have specialist knowledge and are able to work on the area of job creation. So in the same way as job carving is a strategy used with learning disabilities, we think it's a really important strategy to use for people with chronic illness, that we need to look at the job offers that are available in the labour market and how they can be tailored and adapted and redesigned so that they're more suitable for people who can only work reduced hours, who need particularly flexible hours, who need high levels of autonomy in the workplace and who need provision to work from home. So hopefully that could be a big part of the strategy.
Thank you.
That would actually improve engagement if we, for example, the government was to speak to Astrid. What else would good engagement look like to you for if we were starting the strategy again, or if the government wanted to sort of do more engagement with disabled people now?
Well, we'd be very happy. Chronic Illness Inclusion is a recently constituted disabled people's organisations, and we would be really, really happy to meet with the government developing this strategy and to talk more about our work, our research, and we have really good engagement with our supporters. Very, very active group of when we put out surveys and consultations among our supporters, we get huge volumes of replies. So we have a very active kind of membership, if you like, and we'd be really willing to meet with government to share our work.
Sort of same questions to Sarah first, and then Karen. So kind of what you hope to see in the strategy, and also what good engagement looks like for future consultation.
Absolutely. The strategy and the green paper actually provide a real opportunity for change. That it will be fantastic to grasp, and be interesting to think about how every government department thinks about how they can ensure their policies are inclusive for disabled people as well. This issue doesn't sit just within one government department. We'd like the strategy to take a very broad look at the challenges that disabled people face. And there are some really important issues within there that have come out in previous sessions that have held, such as tackling and reducing poverty amongst disabled people, which is a real issue and must be one of the priorities. Some of the other issues we think it should include are, for example, better financial support for disabled people, both in and out of work. A starting point there would be to give legacy benefits, the £20 uplift that was given to universal credit claimants at the start of the pandemic. Things like access to inclusive transport, better provision of accessible housing, a social care system that supports the needs of disabled working adults. We know in multiple sclerosis that 1 in 3 people say they don't have the social care support that they need, and that is often quite important around employment as well. For example, you may need support, as I've mentioned previously, to actually get up and ready for work in the morning. And more generally, measures that can help improve social attitudes to disabilities. We've talked a lot today around awareness and around supporting employers, and the more that we can talk about these issues, why it's really, really important, then the better. Oh, and in terms of engagement with disabled people, there is much more that can be done. And I think it's also really important to remember that there are a variety of methods that are needed, and not just to rely on one form of consultation or one survey. As came out in the previous session today, there are lots of, adjustments that need to be made, and also digital will work for some people, it won't work for others. So we really need to think about what is best to meaningfully engage disabled people in these really important areas.
Karen.
Yeah, try not to be repetitive. I'd like to see a really clear definition of who is disabled, what disability is. I don't know what Debbie would say to this, but most of my patients with arthritis do not perceive they're disabled. If you read the disability definition in the Act, they are, but they don't think of themselves as disabled. I also think it would be really nice to see a better definition of what reasonable adjustments look like from the perspective of different types of impairments, so that employers are clear on what's the minimum they should be providing as a reasonable adjustment. Engagement, absolutely key, and I think it needs to be engagement with people with mental health conditions, musculoskeletal conditions, the whole range of different types of impairments, so that we get a real feeling that any policy made, any strategy devised is led by them. They've told us what would work for them. We need better data. We really do need to clarify what we're going to collect in order to show any progress from the strategy. What are our targets, and have we met them, and when are we going to evaluate that? I absolutely urge the importance of the strategy being nested across departments. It cannot just be one department. This has got to be around local government. For young people with chronic disabling conditions, or epilepsy, or mental ill health, or autism and arthritis, they need to have a chance of getting a job, and we really need to improve the career planning for them and give them much better support through access to work to make sure they get in the workplace. And I couldn't reiterate more strongly Sarah's point about why we're leaving our disabled people in poverty. This is wrong.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now, we're a little bit up against the clock, and there are three more questioners to come. So I will try and move things along a bit just to speed up this concluding section. The first contributor is Chris Stevens.
Thank you, Chair, and welcome to the panellists. Just following on from Siobhan's question then, there's obviously, and thinking about the role of Job Centre Plus itself, what improvements can the department make to support offers unemployed disabled people? Maybe start with yourself, Catherine.
Thank you. So we've heard that there are more disability employment advisors coming on board, but in the context of what's happened through the pandemic, and that there are, I think, 25,000 more work coaches being put in place, the number of disability employment advisors is still much too small in proportion to the number of work coaches. So we need work coaches to have impairment-specific knowledge so that they can apply solutions, not one size fits all, but according to people's support needs. So we want to see more disability employment advisors within job centres, having impairment-specific knowledge, specifically around energy impairment, obviously. And in terms of work coaches, for them to apply a personalised approach, and especially applying conditionality in a personalised way, they need to understand that issue that with energy limited chronic illness, it's about the number of hours you can do rather than the type of work you can do. So that's hugely important when it comes to in-work conditionality under universal credit. We have a real concern that if people are able to earn to work just a few hours a week, they're going to come under pressure to increase their hours, because there's that inbuilt assumption in universal credit that you need to progress from part-time into full-time work, which is completely inappropriate for people with energy impairment. So in order for work coaches to apply conditionality in a personalised way, and in a way that's not going to put people under pressure and create more stress, we need that impairment-specific knowledge across job centres. So, more specialism, more investment in disability employment advisors.
Thanks, Catherine. And I note your comments on the disability employment advisors, so thank you for answering that. Sarah, over to you. And is there also things that DWP can do to improve employers' knowledge?
When we ran a survey and asked people with multiple sclerosis in the past 12 months, have you received support to help you find employment? 61% of those people said no, but I needed support. And also people with MS have told us that they actually avoid applying for benefits to avoid having to deal with the job centre. So there is much more that we need to do there. I don't want to repeat what Catherine said, but I do agree, around her points around much better understanding amongst work coaches, the need for disability employment advisors, and actually how that system works really well to provide the support that is needed so that more people feel confident actually in accessing that support as well.
Thank you, Professor.
Thanks, Chris. So callers to Versus Arthritis tell us that they have a real problem with Job Centre Plus as the sort of poacher gamekeeper role. They're there for the gatekeeping of the benefits, and then you're supposed to go to them for help and support to remain in work, and have a real fear of what information is being transferred. So one wonders if actually it's the best placement of our work advisors, our work coaches, whether we should be linking that more with access to work and separating it off from the benefit system. Certainly something that needs thinking through, because it's not helping people at the moment. They're fearful of going, fearful of full disclosure. In terms of what managers need, we've talked about knowledge and skills. I think actually it's a leadership culture from the top. So if your manager's on your back because your productivity's dropped, you're not going to be very empathic to the person that you're trying to support with a health issue. So we just need a whole culture shift in the organisation. I think it's worth noting, no one said it so far, that we have dropped the capacity for occupational health in most of our businesses in this country. Less than half of people in the UK have access to any occupational health. So they're either turning to a specialist or their GP. GPs tell us they don't want to do this. They think it gets in the way of what they do. And we really do need to think about, it's a telephone call provided by a commercial provider of OH services, usually someone not a doctor or a nurse, really a substitute for good occupational health support in the workplace.
Thanks very much. Excellent answers. Back to yourself, Chair.
Thank you very much. Selene Saxby.
Thank you, Chair, and morning, everybody. So, and some of the question I have here, I think you've just touched on, so I know in the interest of time, if we can just focus on any additional information you'd like to add. In your view, how well is the benefit system achieving its aim of supporting disabled people into work? And as we know, DWP's view is that the conditionality and sanctions regime acts as a work incentive. But in your view, what impact is that having on supporting the people you represent into work? I'm not sure who'd like to go first. Beth, would you like to go first? Thank you.
I'm happy to. I mean, I think we all know that it's horrible. I don't know if you... I'm lucky enough to talk to patients in clinic, and they tell me their experiences of the system, and it's punitive and unpleasant, and they feel denigrated and stigmatised by it. I know it's a really tough job. I feel really sorry for the assessors. I would hate being their job, but many of them are not qualified in any medical discipline or allied health profession, and the basic answer is no, you can't have, and you have to appeal, and then it's maybe you can have, and it's horrible.
Thank you, Sarah. Was there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, so just to just talk about multiple sclerosis for a second. So the majority of people with MS who claim employment and support allowance, for example, are placed in the support group and have no working requirement conditionality attached to their benefit. Now that's good, but actually a small number with MS in this group actually do want to do some work, for example, to fit some freelance work that they can fit in around their condition. There's a real reluctance to do this because of fear of losing their benefits, and that's the thing that kind of we hear quite a lot, so that if you change one thing, there's a real fear that you will lose something and you will lose out. There is, and I just wanted to go back to Karen's point around the conversations around employment support and financial support probably need to be separated. It isn't particularly helpful, and it is causing issues. And my understanding as well that it is incredibly difficult and quite a stressful situation for people when they are claiming for benefits. And conditionality and sanctions for people claiming ESA, for example, are they helping? Should they be scrapped? And my understanding is that there is actually no clear evidence to suggest that conditionality and sanctions help disabled people to re-enter work and stay in work, and that some of the evidence is emerging that the opposite actually may be true.
Thank you. Catherine, was there anything you wish to add?
Yes, I would concur with what everyone said. The reliance on conditionality and sanctions as the tool for getting disabled people into work has completely backfired and taken so many people backwards. I had the experience of being sanctioned myself while I was on ESA, which was horrific, and added a mental health condition on top of my physical health condition. And it's resulted in people not trusting Job Centre Plus and not trusting work coaches. And I completely agree with what the other speakers have said, that employment support needs to move closer to access to work and away from the gatekeeping role. I think we also really need to address the adequacy of benefit rates as well as the security of the benefit system. The benefit rates in general are among the lowest in the OECD, and we need to remember that disabled people on legacy benefits like ESA have been left out of the £20 uplift to universal credit. So people are trying to survive on rates of benefit that are not meeting their basic needs, certainly not allowing them to participate in society, and so not giving them a platform from which they can, manage their health condition and take a positive approach to managing some kind of return to work. And the insecurity of the benefit system, the flaws in the assessments, the onerous process of appeals and the frequency of reassessments means people are living on a kind of constant treadmill of anxiety about losing the little that they've got in terms of benefits. And again, that is just not a place from which people can improve their lives or, fulfill their aspirations, because people do aspire to do a better life and to working if that's possible for them. And putting them in this place of deprivation and anxiety and insecurity is pulling people backwards, and so it really needs to be addressed.
Thank you all. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. And Nigel Mills.
Thank you. I mean, this sort of, I think, follows on from some of the earlier comments, but what's the panel's view on the work capability assessment and how that works, and whether that it's a really useful tool for determining eligibility for financial support, and perhaps whether we could find a better way of linking that assessment through to actually what sort of support people need to get into work and to stay into work, rather than just doing an assessment and then not really using any of the information for any perhaps more useful purpose afterwards. Sarah, did you want to start?
People with MS have continually raised with us significant concerns about the accuracy and the quality of the work capability assessment, and I think there probably does need to be significant change and improvement to it. Perhaps now is the opportunity to do that with the long-awaited Green Paper, and we would really urge the government to take that opportunity to look at designing a new assessment that includes descriptors and underpinning principles which are appropriate, and also recognise some of the issues that we've been talking today around how conditions are very different and they're often different day to day for an individual as well. How do we build that kind of recognition in? And I'd also just like to flag again the importance of actually involving disabled people and disabled people's organisations in actually looking at kind of the assessment and looking how it could be redesigned. That is so important.
Thank you. Catherine, any comments?
Yes, we agree. We'd like to see the work capability assessment completely redesigned. In particular, we'd like to see it have an indicator so that it could measure the number of hours that people can work in any 1 week reliably and sustainably. This is done in other countries. It's part of the measurement of how close people are to the labour market. Someone at the moment WCA only assesses different functions in isolation to each other, but it gives you no way of differentiating someone who can work 5 hours a week from someone who can work 35 hours a week. So that's obviously a key measure of employability that's not at all that WCA has no way of measuring. We would like it to be much more robust in accounting for cognitive fatigue and dysfunction. For example, with long COVID, 85% of people say that cognitive dysfunction is a key work-limiting disability, and yet the descriptors in the WCA that apply to cognitive, intellectual and mental function are never applied to energy-limiting chronic illness, because they're only applied to people with specific diagnoses like brain injury and learning disability. And this is kind of a wrong approach that uses diagnosis first rather than impairment and impact. We'd like it to be able to take a more holistic look at people's lives, of how they have to account for their energy and allocate it, rather than looking at different activities in isolation for each other. Say take, you might be able to do activity X, Y, and Z, for example, if you've got chronic illness, but you can't do, once you've done one of them, you can't do the other two in any one day. So you need to have a kind of a relational approach that looks at that how you can do activities in relation to other activities, because that gives a more accurate picture of actually how much energy people have to allocate to work. So yeah, I think we'd like to see those three things built into a new design for assessments.
Okay, thank you. Karen, anything to add to those?
Just one story. I don't understand it, Nigel, if I'm really honest. I look after a 58-year-old lady with rheumatoid arthritis and HIV. She adopted her grandchildren who are 10 and 13. The 13-year-old has severe autism. Her arthritis is bad. She applied to the WCA and she got completely turned down, so she's just taken an extra 12 hours of care work so that she can support her family. It's just wrong, Nigel.
Yeah, it does sound like a strange outcome, but none of you have said that you think there's no role for capability assessment in this process. What you want is for the assessment to work properly. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, I'd say the qualification of the people doing it and the criteria against which they're judging are very punitive.
But no one thinks we could just rely on what the GP or specialist says. We do have some kind of independent assessment.
So we did do that in the past. I've written many of those forms in my life, as I'm sure Ben has. And of course, we're advocates to our patients. So it doesn't feel right that it should be the medic making the assessment, but it has to be something in the middle between these two extremes.
That's just not a question for you, Karen, but I mean, would it help if the outcome of the assessment was we think this person can work for 16 hours if there's this adaptation and there's this support available, if that actually fed through and actually that adaptation and that support was then on their file and was advised to employers, so the system was joined up rather than it being assumed at one thing and then forgotten about for the rest?
Couldn't agree more.
Catherine, Sarah, any comments on that? Catherine?
Yes, I absolutely agree that at the moment it's completely disjointed. The WCA is disjointed from employment support and it's disjointed from access to work. And so what we want is an assessment that, as you say, accounts for hours of work and also, crucially, what support people need and the availability of that support. And and then gives that person an indication that that support would be available, for example, from access to work, and that type of job is available and exists within the labour market. At the moment, it's a kind of purely theoretical exercise that looks at whether you can pick up a pound coin and then reach into your top pockets. But where are the jobs where you just need to pick up a pound coin or reach into your top pocket? It needs to be much more grounded in the real world of what employment offers, what job offers are available, what support is available. And so, yeah, I agree with the approach that you've suggested there.
Thank you. Sarah?
Yeah, well, it's currently an inadequate process that leads to stress and anxiety for a lot of people. And in some cases, people are actually not receiving the financial support that they need. So absolutely, yes, more joined up and, as Catherine said, grounded actually in the real world.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, and that concludes our question. Thank you all very much indeed. I found that a very interesting and useful session. We're grateful to all of you. Thank you for being with us. If there is anything else that occurs to you after the session that you think we ought to know about, please do email. We'll be interested in any follow-up thoughts that you've got. And that brings our meeting to an end. Order. Meeting has ended.